Tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran are escalating to new heights, drawing the United States into a confrontation with the Islamic Republic after a sophisticated attack targeted Saudi Arabia's Aramco oil facility, the largest processing facility in the world, knocking out half of the country's oil capacity, or more than 5 million barrels a day, and leaving the oil fields in flames. The attack was nothing the kingdom had ever seen before. According to US and Saudi intel, 18 drones and 7 cruise missiles were launched and went undetected by both American and Saudi radar systems, including going unnoticed by the US military base nearby, the Prince Sultan Air Base, which is guarded by an American Patriot missile defense system and over 500 US military personnel. Now, you better believe an attack at this level, targeting a crossroad for global oil supplies, did more than ruffle a few feathers. Panic not only struck the kingdom and the international community, where oil prices spiked 19%, the highest ever recorded one-day increase, but US and Saudi politicians, as well as a chorus of mainstream pundits, began to beat the drums of war, targeting an old foe, Iran.
The Iranians directly attacked the Saudis. It's a major escalation, and the first time we have seen a direct attack by the Iranians.
What do you think the chances are that the president could meet with Rouhani when they say, yeah, I'll meet with you if you lift all the sanctions?
I think the president needs to act now, and he needs to act with partners in a fashion so the Iranians will not do this ever again.
Saudi and US military analysts have presented satellite images of where the missiles landed, purporting to show that the drones and missiles came from the direction of Iran. But several experts are already countering these claims, pointing out that the images show impact points that are indeed west-northwest, which is the opposite direction of Iran. Now, despite providing no substantial evidence and citing so-called anonymous intelligence, the same intelligence that, to justify the war in Iraq, claimed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, and that Saddam was working with Al-Qaeda, the corporate media has amplified and endorsed the Saudi and Trump administration's claims to manufacture consent for an all-out war with Iran, which would be totally disastrous and would draw the international community into a global conflict with scores of civilian casualties. But none of that seems to matter to the lapdog media. NBC and CNN repeated the official line that Iran was likely behind the attack, and CNBC took Saudi officials' words as gospel, without once questioning this government narrative that is setting us up on a war path with the Islamic Republic. Now, Saudi Arabia said it would forcefully respond to these aggressions. Meanwhile, President Trump announced the US was locked and loaded and ready to retaliate, then escalated tensions by announcing a new substantial round of sanctions against Iran. But Iran is not taking these threats of war very lightly.
I'm making a very serious statement that we don't want war. We don't want to engage in a military confrontation. We believe that a military confrontation based on deception is awful, will have a lot of casualties, but we won't blink to defend our territory.
Put yourself in Saudi Arabia's shoes. If there was an attack on Iranian sovereign territory with cruise missiles launched from Saudi Arabia, what would Iran's response be?
Well, they're making that up. Why do they want to make that up, that it was from Iranian territory? The Yemenis have announced responsibility for that. They have provided information about that. They have answered all the Saudi disinformation campaign about the fact that they launched this attack against Saudi Arabia in self-defense. Now, they want to pin the blame on Iran in order to achieve something, and that is why I'm saying this is agitation for war.
Indeed, while the media is choking up the airwaves with pro-war and anti-Iranian propaganda, what's been lost, or perhaps purposely left out from this coverage, is who actually took responsibility for this attack and why. Yemen's Ansarullah Houthi movement immediately claimed responsibility. Houthi military spokesman Brigadier Yahya Sarri announced, "We assure the Saudi regime that our long hand can reach any place we want at any time we choose." And this wouldn't be the first time Yemen's resistance movement launched an attack on Saudi soil. Just last year, Saudi officials said they intercepted more than 100 missiles fired from Yemen. Now, Ansarullah has spent the last 5 years resisting US Saudi-backed bombardment of Yemen. which has created the world's worst humanitarian crisis, leaving over 100,000 people dead, over 23 million people starving, a cholera health crisis, and a human trafficking epidemic. The humanitarian crisis kills a Yemeni child every 10 minutes from preventable diseases, starvation, and malnutrition. Saudi Arabia enforced an illegal blockade preventing food, fuel, and medical supplies from entering the war-torn nation, and effectively weaponizing humanitarian aid after taking a key seat on a UN human rights panel. Now, I don't ever remember the Trump or Obama administration slapping Saudi Arabia with sanctions or hear the media cry over the spilled blood of thousands of Yemenis. Did you? Perhaps if the media did their job in reporting these facts, it would be an absolute embarrassment for the US military machine. It would expose the utter failure of billions of dollars worth of Saudi and American military defense systems against a grassroots resistance movement taking on the Goliath of the US-Saudi-backed coalition's genocidal war against the Middle East's now porous country. Blaming Iran for an attack on the world's largest oil processing site suits the interests of American allies in the region, including Saudi Arabia and Israel. Now, the story presented to Western audiences by the mainstream media is rationalized by a carefully crafted and false narrative that the US-backed Saudi-led war against Yemen, which has dropped over 50,000 bombs on that country, bombs made and supplied by the USA, is to prevent an expanding Iran that is arming the Ansar Allah Houthi movement. But leaked internal documents show that many of these connections made by military intelligence were deliberately fabricated, and Yemenis are actually capable of manufacturing their own weapons and have access to stockpiles of armaments from previous conflicts. Just as the US claimed that all of their interventions during the Cold War were to defend against Soviet aggression, now any region in the Middle East the empire wants to expand, exploit, and occupy is conveniently labeled an Iranian outpost, justifying military aggression. The United States and Saudi Arabia need to maintain the status quo of endless war in Yemen because beyond the current crisis, the US military has occupied this tiny nation for decades in its war on terror, drone bombing civilians, setting up military outposts and torture facilities while exploiting the nation's rich mineral resources. Yemen is considered the richest country in the region in terms of minerals, oil, culture, and history, including being called a living museum with architectural structures dating back to before the time of Christ. But today, UNICEF described its economy and society as on the verge of collapse. The military occupation of Yemen has given the people there a death sentence so the US can rattle its saber at Iran to justify the expansion of its empire that feeds the mouth of the military-industrial complex and keeps Saudi oil flowing through key Yemeni ports. For decades, manufacturing consent for war by using false pretexts has been seized by both parties, whether Democratic or Republican. Both have spread disinformation to demonize an entire nation in order to drum up support for war. Now, with the Saudi oil fields burning, this disinformation campaign moves into high gear, ignoring or selectively reporting not just key physical evidence, but also the whole context of the humanitarian crisis in Yemen that has given rise to the desperate measures to which the Houthis have been forced to turn to, a right to self-defense under the Geneva Conventions. If the media cared to report on this context, it would expose the US coalition as a paper tiger, which would mean that all of the blood and billions spent by Washington in the Middle East was essentially for nothing. It would also show the world that a grassroots united front like the Ansar Allah Houthi movement can successfully defend their nation against the strongest militaries in the world and break the chains of modern-day colonialism. After landing in Saudi Arabia this week, Mike Pompeo scolded the media for asking him about the Houthis claiming responsibility for the attack. His response was that they are liars, and when referring to them, you should call them the lying Houthis. This coming from the man who on video admitted to lying and deception while heading the CIA. And just as before, it's not the politicians like Pompeo that pay for their lies, but the ordinary people who pay with their lives.